Welcome. Welcome, everyone that has joined the Art at Noon. Seems like it's been a while since we've had an Art at Noon, so I'm very excited to do this again. I love this moment of the day on Wednesdays where we can learn from scholars and artists, but also get to sort of take a break from our day. And my name is Lori. I guess I didn't introduce myself. My name is Lori. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Programs. And I also wanted to say that the Art at Noon lectures are supported by the Lefko family in memory of a beloved member of the docent corps, Mildred T. Lefko. And now I am happy to introduce and hand over the mic to Dr. Anna O'Marley, PAFA's Chief of Curatorial Affairs, and also the curator of the amazing exhibition, Making American Artists, Stories from PAFA, 1776 to 1976. I'm so glad that you can introduce Dr. Elder. Thank you, Anna, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you all for joining us for, I believe, our first Art at Noon of 2023. I'm so excited that Nika is kicking us off and that I am able to welcome her back to PAFA virtually, and then we look forward to having her here physically. Nika has spoken with us before, and I can't remember if it was in an Art at Noon program or if it was when she was a graduate student. And yes, when she was a graduate student and she participated in our wonderful graduate series, we had it for a number of years of graduate symposia that were around our exhibitions. And I remember then being incredibly impressed by Nika. And of course, now she continues to impress the field. Dr. Nika Elder now is Assistant Professor of American Art at American University in Washington, D.C. And her research and teaching examine the reciprocal relationship between art and race throughout modern American history. Her first book, William Harnett's Curious Objects, Still Life Painting After the American Civil War, was published by the University of California Press in October of 2022. So congratulations, Nika, for that publication. It's beautiful. I was happy to see a copy because we had some work reproduced in it. Whenever I get those books at my desk, I have to send them to the library, but I always send a note and say, if you don't want this, please give it to me, because it looks so beautiful. And she's currently at work on a monograph tentatively titled John Singleton Copley's Taste for Flesh, which I promise is not about cannibalism. Maybe. Okay. All right. I saw some of her
at times.
Okay. I saw the shark one. So that wasn't cannibalism. And she's published related articles in Art History and Winterthur Portfolio. As I mentioned, I've known Nika's work on Harnett since she was a graduate student. And so I'm thrilled to have invited her here today to talk about Harnett in connection with our exhibition, Making American Artists, which is currently on view at PAFA until April 2nd, a special section on still life across 200 years. And we'll be traveling around the country in a national tour with a publication to come out related to the exhibition, probably this fall. So Nika, welcome and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation, for the lovely introduction, and just for your help throughout this project from its dissertation phase to now the publication of the book. As you all will hear, Harnett studied at PAFA, so I was lucky to do some research in the archives and have been bothering numerous different people on staff for well over a decade. So thank you all, and thank you, Lori, for your help in organizing the event today. Thank you all for being here on what I hear is a lovely day outside on the East Coast. So I especially appreciate that. So I'll be focusing on the Harnett painting that is in Anna's exhibition, Making American Artists. But from there, I will be kind of spinning out into a synopsis of the book as a whole. So I will definitely be covering a lot of territory, so I really do welcome any and all questions after the presentation. So with that, let me share my screen. Oh, Lori, it says that screen sharing is disabled. Oh, now it's working. Okay, great. I am gleefully rusty with Zoom presentations following too many of them during the pandemic. All right, great. So with that, I'll get started. In 1878, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts acquired a painting that epitomized the kind of work that instructors at the institution wanted and taught their students to make. Benjamin West's Penn's Treaty with the Indians, which is on view in Making American Artists, is a consummate history painting. A tableau comprised of multiple figures, it pictures an event from the distant past in order to communicate contemporary civic values. The canvas depicts an apocryphal meeting that was supposed to have taken place in the late 17th century. Led by William Penn, a group of Quakers looks on as merchants kneel before members of the Lenni Lenape, brokering their wares. Ostensibly, the painting pictures the origins of the colony and the state of Pennsylvania, but in reality, it depicts representatives of the colonial elite bringing civilization, in quotes, and capitalism to the indigenous people of present-day North America. In the late 1870s, despite residing in London for most of his life, Benjamin West was already known and cherished in the United States as one of the first American painters. So PAFA was eager to bring another work by him into its rapidly growing collection. And earlier in the 19th century, the museum had in fact mortgaged its building in order to buy Benjamin West's Death on a Pale Horse. But Penn's treaty with the Indians was more than a feather in the institution's cap. It was also a masterclass in the conventions of history painting. Firstly, several of the figures' poses derive from classical statuary and Renaissance works that relied upon it. Scholars have likened the standing chief here to the Apollo Belvedere, and the physique of the seated men before him. So here, if you can see my arrow, I'm referring to this man, but also these men over here, have been likened to the Belvedere torso. The young hunter at the left edge of the canvas, so this young boy here, resonates with Michelangelo's David, and the mother and child before him resonate with multiple images of the Madonna and Child, and this one that I'm showing you is by Raphael. By modeling his indigenous subjects after these canonical works, West signaled their potential to be integrated into British society. In addition to referencing and exploiting classical Western art in his depiction of individual figures, West also carefully choreographed the tableau to encapsulate in one image a complex relationship that actually spanned several decades, if not centuries. For example, we might note how, in addition to referencing the Apollo Belvedere, the standing chief's pose, and here I'm referring to this gentleman, mirrors that of William Penn in the painting. As reflections of one another, their postures communicate and indeed embody their cooperative relationship in matters both political and economic. On and off for just over 10 years, American painter William Harnett trained in this tradition. From 1866 to 1877, he took antique classes and life classes at both PAFA in Philadelphia and the National Academy of Design in New York. On the screen are two of his student drawings, one after the Venus de Milo and another after the Borghese Warrior, which he submitted in order to be accepted into life classes at PAFA. These drawings were the product of exercises that versed him in the visual vocabulary and technical skills required to create history paintings like Penn's Treaty with the Indians. Yet in 1878, the same year that PAFA acquired West's work, Harnett submitted a painting that resembled the one on the screen to the institution's 49th annual exhibition. Titled An Evening's Comfort, it was a still life painting of a pipe and various accoutrements. Harnett's apparent about face, his shift from history painting to still life, is the subject of my talk today. Academicians prized history painting as an intellectual pursuit with civic significance, and they marginalized still life as an exercise in imitation. So why would Harnett abandon the former for the latter? Why would he forego depicting idealized human figures and instead base his paintings on worn, man-made objects? To answer these questions, I'll take us on a deep dive into Harnett's painting titled Still Life, which appears in the exhibition. While Penn's treaty appears in the history painting section of Making American Artists, Still Life, befitting its title, appears in the section dedicated to that genre. Ultimately, however, I hope to demonstrate that still life is not a refutation of history painting, but in fact, a reimagining of that genre for the post-Civil War era. I'll demonstrate that Harnett deployed and pictured objects as a means to address the past without depicting the human figure. His choice of models and the way he composed his paintings both visualized and enacted the type of intellectual activity that the Academy had long prized. By investing still life with this quality, Harnett and his career reveal much about the Civil War and its impact on academic practice. Harnett painted still life in 1887, and it is a classic late work by the artist. His earliest tabletop still lifes, like the one on the screen, assembled objects to reference specific places and professions. And this work, for example, alludes to a man at his leisure. Harnett's mature work, one second, because my next slide is not advancing. Oh, there we go. Harnett's mature works pictured solitary entities on display, either animal corpses like those found in early modern still lifes, or defunct objects like those found in the anthropological museums sprouting up across the country at this time. But Harnett's late works picture eclectic assortments of man-made objects. Take still life, for example. A complete inventory of its contents would read a violin, a Dutch jug filled with flowers, most likely a Roman lamp, a Turkish rug, selected sheet music, and at least 5 aged books. Scholars have done much work to try to identify the specific objects in Harnett's paintings, but the artist often preemptively foiled our efforts. He took liberties in depicting his subjects on canvas, sometimes combining multiple objects into one, or consciously obfuscating any identifying text. He then did not want viewers to be able to identify the specific models for his paintings. Rather, he wanted them to meditate on the meanings and associations that things like musical instruments, decorative objects, and even text carried in the final quarter of the 19th century. Indeed, late 19th century viewers would have encountered objects similar to those seen in still life in a variety of places. Stores and homes for sure, but also museums and industrial fairs. In these contexts, which is to say commercial and cultural venues, these objects were referred to as manufactures. Today's industrial arts or applied arts, manufactures referred to objects that had been designed, whether they were ultimately made by hand or by machine. Harnett was acquainted with manufactures from his early experiences working in the silver industry. From 1869 to 1875, the artist supported himself and his studies at the National Academy of Design by working days as a silver engraver at Wood & Hughes and perhaps Tiffany & Co. These firms were among the most reputable silver manufacturers in the country. And understanding how Harnett made manufactures in this context helps explain what it would mean for him to picture them in his late work. On the screen is a napkin ring that Harnett made for his friend William Blemley, as well as a page from a sketchbook that he kept during his time as an engraver. We cannot say for sure whether these two designs are definitively linked, but as you can see, this drawing in the lower right-hand corner resonates quite closely with the overall design on the napkin ring. Harnett likely derived his initial sketch up here in the sketchbook from a reference book like Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament. Indeed, both Tiffany and Gorham, another major silver manufacturer at the time, maintained extensive libraries and collections for the benefit of their engravers and designers. Harnett would encounter motifs like those that appear on this page from the Grammar of Ornament, transcribe them into his sketchbook, and then modify them to arrive at a final design that he engraved onto a piece of silverware. So in this case, for example, looking at the top row, we can see how Harnett flipped the lines and played with shading before devising the design in the lower right-hand corner. Now, clearly there are some important differences between the sketch and the final engraving. The sketch is much simpler and composed strictly of full straight lines, whereas the engraving is far more florid. One of the two lines in each band is serrated. This is in the engraving rather than straight. And there's shading within the large spirals as well as the triangles at the top and bottom of the motif. Some of these differences can likely be attributed to the exigencies and opportunities of translating a sketch on paper into an engraving in silver. But Harnett clearly also took this opportunity to vary the quality of the lines, the forms, and the shapes that comprise the design. Such differences allow us to see the creative work that went into engraving and into design in general. These were not mechanical processes, but creative acts reliant upon research, experimentation, and innovation. Manufactures like the napkin ring that Harnett engraved for Blemley were the result of this intellectual work. The violin, Dutch jug, lamp, and rug, even the sheet music and books in Harnett's Stilllife can and should be viewed through this lens. In his late works, Harnett replaced the human models that he had been taught to draw at PAFA and the National Academy with man-made models of good design. Rather than visualize war and depredation then, his paintings allude to the history of human innovation and culture. Yet, for all the similarities between the manufacturers in Harnett's late paintings and those seen at museums and world's fairs, there were important differences in how these objects appeared in these contexts. On the screen are Frank Waller's 1881 painting of a visitor to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and an illustration of the interior of Wanamaker's department store. As you can see at both sites, the objects were organized into neat and orderly tableaux that facilitated and encouraged close looking. By contrast, in Harnett's late works like Stilllife and the Old Cupboard Door, which I'll show you in a moment, the objects appear to be in complete disarray. They have been piled on top of one another or seemingly haphazardly slung up on nails. Understanding how Harnett achieved this effect, this kind of feigned disarray, revealed that as much as the artist's paintings pictured manufactures, they aspired to read as them too. That is to say, Harnett drew his subjects, but also his pictorial strategies from the field of industrial design. And the images on the screen illustrate this process. First, Harnett selected objects from his extensive collection of models And on the far left, I'm showing you one illustration from the catalog for his posthumous estate sale that contained many of the objects within his, again, extensive collection. Then he would arrange them within the studio, but also on the pages of sketchbooks and in drawings. And that's what we're seeing in the central image here. It is the only sketch that is linked definitively to a specific Harnett painting. And if you look closely at the especially the two largest drawings on this sheet, he's clearly playing with the placement of the main objects in the composition, namely the instruments that appear in the painting on the right. So neither of these works, either the old cupboard door or Stilllife, pictures a configuration of man-made objects that one would have seen in real life. The types of objects are too eclectic and the compositions are too dense. It is these very qualities that attest to the careful planning and thinking that Harnett put into the paintings. Each object was carefully selected and placed to create a cohesive tableau, but also to convey the work, the imagination that went into producing them. In this sense, like the instruments, decorative objects, and printed matter pictured within them, the late paintings can also be understood as manufactures, or in other words, as products of design. Like Harnett's engravings, his paintings were not rote imitations of existing objects or tableau, but the result of a rigorous decision-making process. The irony of Harnett's practice, though, is that he leaned on this strategy in order to elevate the status of Stilllife as a genre. Throughout the 19th century, most Western art academies subscribed to the hierarchy of genres codified at the end of the 18th century. In response to domestic and international politics, which relates to the topic of my next book on Copley, academicians like Sir Joshua Reynolds in England positioned history painting as the pinnacle of artistic production and Stilllife as the nadir of it. This assessment was based on two criteria: the amount of work an artist was perceived to put into a painting and its civic value. According to this logic, history painting deserved the preeminent spot because it was based on historical texts that were translated into poignant narratives that conveyed moral messages to the public. Stilllife, on the other hand, was seen to be purely imitative. It involved skill, but not intellect. One copied existing models in order to create decorative pieces that pleased or even tricked the eye. In his late paintings, Harnett deployed and exploited design then to elevate the status of Stilllife as a genre. By assembling imminently unrelated objects, he foregrounded the role that composition, and by extension creativity, played in the production of his work. But the question remains, why would Harnett go through all this trouble? Why invest Stilllife with the qualities and gravitas associated with history painting? Why did he not simply produce the kind of work that he had trained and studied to create? This final question is a particularly pointed one, since Harnett had a ready topic for history painting at his disposal. The start of his studies actually coincided with the end of the American Civil War. Harnett took his first antique class at PAFA in 1866, not long after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, which you see in the photograph on the right. As we have seen, academicians considered this kind of delicate negotiation, as well as the pointed battles of consequential wars, ripe for history painting. Penn's treaty with the Indians, which PAFA had not yet purchased in 1866, but was well known through prints, is a prime example of this. From the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter to Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the Civil War comprised numerous battles and encounters that would have made for striking multi-figure compositions, offering messages about moral behavior and civic duty. But Harnett did not depict any of these incidents, nor did most ambitious American painters at the time. Contemporary critics made note of this striking absence, and contemporary scholars have offered various theories to explain it, such as the rise of battlefield photography, for example, and changing ideas about history. But Harnett's turn away from figure painting and his embrace of still life and objects reveals another reason for this lacuna. The politics and visual culture of the Civil War had in fact complicated conventional understandings of the heroic male body on which academic painting had until this time been based. On the left, I'm bringing back Harnett's drawing of the Borghese Warrior, a Hellenistic sculpture of a gladiator who likely once held a shield in his left hand and a sword in his right. And beside the drawing are two of the many portrait photographs taken of soldiers before, during, and after the Civil War. In the center is Louis Troutman of the United States Colored Infantry, and to his right is Private Ebenezer Smith of the 11th Maine Volunteers. We know nothing about Troutman except for his name and affiliation. And what we know about Smith comes from the book in which this photo was printed, the Army Medical Museum's photographs of surgical cases and specimens. Much can be said about both photos, which I address in the book, but for our purposes today, suffice it to say that these images and the soldiers that they picture differed markedly from the heroic white men that Harnett and others were taught to depict. Troutman was just one of many Black men who put his life on the line for the Union, and Smith was just one of many white veterans who benefited from advances in martial surgery, but who lost a limb in the process. These images and the soldiers that they represent challenge the Academy's vision of what war and what heroism had looked like. Harnett made a few early works that attempted to grapple with the war's realities, but relatively quickly he abandoned this project in favor of still life. The work on the screen clearly witnesses Harnett's embrace of objects, but located in the long shadow of the Civil War, it becomes clear that it exhibits a decisive turn away from the body too. As Black soldiers and white amputees, as well as photographs of them, challenged everything Harnett had learned about war, history painting, and the relationship between them, the artist used objects and deployed still life as a means to address the past without depicting the human figure. He was still vested in the core principle of Western art academies, namely that painting could and should provide insight into the human condition and foster civic life. But he used depictions of objects rather than people in order to accomplish this goal. In the 19th century, artists and the public associated the genre of still life with paintings like this one by Severin Rosen, which picture the bounty of the natural world. And notably, this work appears besides still life in Making American Artists. In objects, Harnett found a means to transform still life into a meditation on the human condition instead. Rather than a violent battle or a complicated negotiation, the objects in still life speak to accomplishments in literature, music, and the decorative arts. Further, as we have seen in using strategies and techniques from the design industry to compose the painting, Harnett located the work itself alongside these pursuits, defining and announcing still life as an act of creativity too. Given Harnett's investment in the genre of still life, his conscious efforts to expand its rightful subjects, and his introduction of techniques from the industrial arts into the fine arts, his work may read as a democratization of academic painting, meaning it may read as an attempt to broaden its topical focus and its audience. Focusing on Harnett's trompe-l'oeil style and the commercial venues in which he sometimes showed his work, there are scholars who have made this case. But locating Harnett in the post-Civil War era reveals the conservative impulses that informed his innovative decisions, and thereby tells us much about the important and unrecognized ways in which the war's politics and visual culture impacted American painting. Rather than modify history painting to allow for the kinds of soldiers, the kinds of bodies that fought and survived the Civil War, Harnett used Stilllife to attempt to sidestep the war altogether. This assertion changes and broadens how we think about the relationship between art and politics. When looking for the impact of seismic political events on painting, we, meaning scholars, curators, the public in general, often look for explicit depictions of those events. In the case of the Civil War, that means paintings like this one by Winslow Homer. The painting that launched the artist's career, Prisoners from the Front, pictures a Union general's capture of Confederate soldiers in Virginia in 1864. It is arguably one of the closest things we have to a history painting of the conflict. But I want to suggest that in its elision of this subject matter, Stilllife and Harnett's work in general is no less reflective of its historical moment. Embracing objects enabled him to avoid depicting the body and thereby avoid addressing the complicated racial politics and gender politics that attended the war. I make this assertion not to blame the artist for failing to tackle these issues, but to point out that not addressing these subjects was a choice too, and further that it was a choice that maintained the status quo. In addition to Harnett, there were other artists at this time who dedicated their careers to still life painting. John Haberly and John F. Pito, whose work also appears in Making American Artists, being the most well-known among them. Excuse me. My book suggests that we might understand the resurgence and reinvention of the genre of still life in the war's wake as an attempt, albeit an unconscious one, to reify the white male perspective on human history that had dominated painting throughout the long 19th century. Harnett and his contemporaries may have challenged the Academy's long-standing devotion to history painting, but they maintained the identity politics from which it emerged. From their founding in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many Western art academies marginalized the practice and display of still life. It was a tool to gain technical skills and a means to decorate the home, but it couldn't teach us anything about ourselves or our world. By organizing Making American Artists according to genre rather than, say, chronology, PAFA challenges this perception and retrieves and reveals the complexity of the genre. The installation visualizes the ways in which Harnett's late 19th century experiments with composition gave rise to abstract works like Marsden Hartley's Flower Abstraction, which you see, for me, it is behind all the lovely Zoom faces here, but in the photo on the right. And how it also gave rise to even works like Louise Neville's sculpture, South Floral, in the photo on the left. And the exhibit also enables us to see how the artist's embrace of objects was a revision of the precedents and strict hierarchies in which he had been trained. Looking at Harnett's still lifes amidst the work, voices, and perspectives of women artists, LGBTQIA+ artists, and artists of color, this allows us to see his paintings anew. His work does not simply index the commodity culture of the Gilded Age in its elisions, in its very silences. It also indexes the war and body politics on which late 19th century prosperity was in fact staked. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nika. Sorry, Lori.
No, go for it.
That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we have lots of time for questions, which is great because I already see some questions
Oh,
in the chat, which is fantastic. But I'm gonna take advantage of my curatorial privilege here to ask you a question about gender and still life. So that's something in particular that I look at in the exhibition. You were talking about the academic genres and the hierarchy of the genres, and of course, it's no accident that one of the reasons women were so successful in still life is it was one of the genres that they had access to, unlike academic history painting. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about you talked some about race, but intersections of gender when looking at still life and history painting in this period.
Yeah, that is a fabulous question. And yeah, so absolutely, as far as Harnett and the men with whom he would have been training and studying understood still life, it very much would have been associated with female practitioners primarily. And it's one of the things that makes his choice of the genre especially perplexing. And one of the ways I think about that is not dissimilarly from his interest in introducing strategies from industrial design into painting, which is that he's basically confronted with the collapse of history painting and the genre in which he had been trained. And so in looking for alternate possibilities, he essentially starts grabbing at, and actually to go back to your earlier term, we could say cannibalizing all of the most marginalized practices. It's one of the things that I find most innovative and interesting about his work is that he draws from still life, he draws from trompe l'oeil, he draws from industrial design, basically anything that had been marginalized. He tries to figure out how to wield it to the ends to which he saw painting should be put. So I think his interest in the genre, in fact, only kind of speaks to the fact that he is trying to retain a male perspective rather than to embrace still life as like a typically female associated practice. I think if that was the case, he would have maybe continued making paintings like those that Severin Rosen did or others did that were still picturing the natural world. But he appropriates the genre and then transforms it too in order to give it the kind of resonance that he wanted it to have.
That's interesting too, that you talk about his appropriation of design and manufacture, and just thinking about the history of women's education in Philadelphia. And of course, the difference between art education in general in the 19th century, the academy, and then in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia School of Design for women. So the idea that women could get this almost this more manufacture type of professionalized art training and be still life painters, but that this academically trained male artist would sort of appropriate those things and then use them for his own practice is interesting.
It's not great. No, but I think, that's exactly what I see him doing. And in fact, it was the opportunity to work on his sketchbook that's in the archives of American art that got me thinking about his experiences in industrial design. It tended to be a kind of side note or footnote in discussions of his work. but he had dedicated as much time to it as he had to his academic training. It in fact supported his academic training. And when I started researching the kind of training he would have received within the silver industry versus the kind of training that he received at art academies, it was actually really striking that, modes of like reproduction were prioritized, in terms of working from casts or the human figure. It was a kind of reproductive, imitative practice. But then looking into what people were learning at design schools at this time or within the design industry, it was an incredibly innovative process. And I think he just happened to appear on the scene at this pivotal moment where there were so many options available to him as like a white male academically trained painter, and he was able to draw from them kind of what he would. So should I jump to some of the questions in the chat here?
I would love that, but I want to read them if that's okay. So the recording people know what people are asking. Lorraine asks, when introducing PAFA's Stilllife, you indicated Harnett was encouraging viewers to meditate on the items, violins, text, etc. Would the average viewer do so? Or were there art critics who would explain and guide this? Today's viewers seem to look briefly and move on. I think
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. His works were shown in a couple of different types of venues. A lot of the scholarship has been on the works being shown in commercial venues, which was very common in the 19th century. But he did also show at art academies. And in those cases, when he was showing his work at PAFA or at the National Academy of Design, there would be catalogs that would be issued that would have at the very least the works titles, which sometimes did indicate like their contents. But I didn't find any kind of primers that were specifically about how to look at and digest the paintings. But there were a lot of reviews of his work that were issued at the time. And the thing I found most fascinating about those is that so many of the critics would actually talk about or wonder and speculate about how long it took him to make the work. So they would say, like, this must have taken him 8 months. I can't imagine that this took less than, 5 hours. So they were thinking about the time, the labor, the effort that he put into these works. And so the fact that the critics saw it that way makes me think that general viewers would have responded to the work in that way too, kind of marveling at it. And I think this is where his interest in trompe-l'oeil comes in too. So this is trompe-l'oeil, refers to trick the eye style. And often his works, since some of them employ this style, have been thought of as being quite deceptive. But we could actually think, if anything, they are the closest thing to a primer on how to look, because they encourage you to kind of to have a sustained looking experience, to question what you're seeing, to engage with the object itself more meaningfully. So I think that kind of close looking was built into the paintings in a way.
There are more questions coming in, so let's just keep going. Amy writes, how would you apply this to still lifes of single objects, like a piece of currency?
Yeah, so I would say there are a couple of different ways to answer that question, because Harnett does go through this phase in his mature career where he is painting solitary objects that are like three-dimensional tools, devices, instruments. And to my mind, those are doing something very different than his very early paintings, where he does do some paintings that are of money, which is inherently flat, two-dimensional. And in fact, it is thinking through the money paintings was one of the ways that I started connecting Harnett to the Civil War. We don't have explicit connections to the Civil War, for example, in this painting, Stilllife, that's up at PAFA now, but it is in his early works that Harnett does introduce some subjects that have to do with the Civil War, and one of them is money, because the money that he chooses to depict is the specific denomination it comes from and originated in the Civil War. So I actually see his early money paintings as an attempt to try and address the Civil War in some way, and to think through questions of value and the different types of value that were ascribed to different types of people at that time. It's somewhat of a different story with the paintings that he makes in his mature career that feature solitary objects. I think those are where he's then, he is at that point in time depicting things like pipes, a gun, horseshoes, all these things that are kind of becoming or about to become defunct. And I think for him in those paintings, he's more so thinking through kind of the way in which an object itself can tell a history. How can you embody history in one made thing? So I hope that answers the question.
Alan writes, thank you, Nika, for the fascinating talk. I wonder if you know the work of Charles Ethan Porter, an African-American still life painter based in Hartford who came of age in the post-Civil War period. If so, any thoughts about his work?
I definitely know of Charles Ethan Porter, but I haven't spent time with his work. But that is a great suggestion to do so. I think an interesting kind of corollary to my take on Harnett is Shana Klein's take on Duncanson's still lifes, which are of the natural world, and see him as kind of embedding abolitionist messages into his work. So there is kind of a context for thinking about still life in these political terms, and more specifically thinking about Black painters using still life in this way. And I think this kind of also goes back to what Anna was asking earlier about the gendering of still life. And I think we could talk about the racing of still life too, and the ways in which different artists of different races kind of were drawn to the genre in different ways and for different reasons.
I feel bad I'm asking everybody's questions. If people, after we're done with these, if people want to just add their questions and come into the Zoom room, that would be great. But let's keep going this way for now. Carol Ann's asked, did he do commissions, paintings of someone's possessions as a sort of portrait? What did he think of portrait painting instead of history painting?
Yeah, so that is a fabulous question. So he definitely did work on commission. He went through phases in his career where he would be incredibly popular. Like by the time he's making these late works, he had quite a well-established reputation, especially among industrialists in the Northeast, Midwest. They really were drawn to his work. Anyone who had any kind of affiliation with the types of objects that appeared in the paintings. And so he would make commissions, and there were some instances where we know that, for example, he used the objects of the person who commissioned the painting. Like a great example of that is the painting he made for, and now I'm completely blanking on the person's last name, but it's at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard, and they have all the objects that are in the painting too. I think you're absolutely right that that kind of painting gestures towards portraiture in a really interesting way. And I think it is because of those kinds of paintings that it's also fair to think about the other still lifes where he is not using a specific person's objects. He's using things from his own collection as a kind of meditation on humanity more broadly rather than a specific individual. And those were the terms in which academic artists really thought about the relationship between history painting and portraiture, that portraiture was like a specific instance, but history painting, you could speak to humanity at large. And so I think you're right that the works he's making on commission where he uses like a specific person's stuff, those we can think of maybe more so as portraiture, and the ones where he's drawing on his own collection more so as in the tradition of history painting.
And Nika, just to follow up on that, you know, the fluidity of genres, I sort of had to come up with a rubric for how to create this installation. And I thought the genres were a way to go through 200 years of paintings and sculpture that was successful. But there is this, when choosing to actually physically lay out the show, there were some times when I had to make some choices, like, is this a portrait? Is this a history painting? Is this a landscape? Particularly when you get into abstraction. But I also think it's very interesting, the discussions that are coming out of this about how to read things that may classically appear to be one genre as completely another. So, you know, if someone else were curating this show or installing it a different way, they could come up with very different connections. And so I love the way you juxtapose the West and the Harnett at the beginning, because that suggests this fluidity of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that this was the vocabulary in which these artists were working and thinking, that was how they structured their understanding of like the visual arts, the visual universe. So it makes sense to me that I think there would be multiple instances where there would be a kind of porousness between the boundaries for sure.
Amanda writes, I've been wondering about his still life patrons. I've thought about this style as being appealing to Quaker business class. Perhaps that's just a factor of being centered in Philadelphia, but do you have any thoughts on his patrons?
Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting work done on them. And the ones that we know about are largely kind of people who were involved in manufacturing and industry, and maybe were not the kind of wealthiest people in that category. So if someone was like a Rockefeller, a Carnegie, then they are actually having portraits made of themselves. Harnett was really working more so with kind of middle managers within these various industries. And it tended to be less like, at least in the way the scholarship has been done to date, the emphasis has been less on their kind of religious, spiritual affiliations and more so on their business interests. And that's kind of why at the end of the talk, I mentioned the connection between essentially the Gilded Age and the Civil War, because this tends to be a very stark divide within the history of American art. The Civil War is over, and then you have this industrial boom that results in great economic prosperity. But we know that that's not how seismic political events unfold, that the Civil War has this long afterlife, and that in fact, everything about that economic prosperity was staked on this like violent, important conflict. And so one of the things that I'm trying to think through in the project is how, like how Harnetts work kind of bridges those two worlds, like the industrial class, and then also those who had experienced the war, either by fighting within it or were most impacted by its results.
Ooh, there's so many good questions, y'all.
Can we answer Jonathan's question?
That's what I was thinking, going right there.
And then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you for this talk. I'm intrigued about your ideas about how he navigated the relationship between art and politics. Could you say a little bit more about that? Are there any artists you noticed that followed in his ideological footsteps, so to speak?
Well, that is a great question from my great master's student, Jonathan. It's so rare that we have a chance to talk about my work, so here we go. I would say that, when it comes to Harnett, he is one of these 19th century figures for whom we have very few primary sources. So there are no actual written documents, letters, journals, what have you, where he expresses political beliefs or ideas. And so in that sense, I'm kind of working with the paintings themselves as an artifact of his thinking. And one of the things that really propelled this project was trying to understand, where else would objects like those that appear in his paintings be seen? And that was how I started researching all these other different avenues, like what was happening in the industrial arts at this time, what was happening with the rise of anthropology museums. And it was really through thinking through these alternate contexts where these objects are seen that were so inherently politicized that it actually becomes clear that if you are making paintings in the wake of the Civil War that have to do in any way with like the history and understanding of humanity, that it is inherently going to be a political project. And I would say, like, there wouldn't be specific painters that I would kind of call out who pick up this thread, although I think they exist and you and I can talk in office hours about who they are. But I would say just kind of like more generally that for me, what I'm hoping one of the things that the book does is to offer a new way to think about the object-based practices that then come to define American art in at least like the first half of the 20th century. And so I really see Harnett as this interesting figure that falls between the history and tradition of still life and then the emergence of like object-based practices, even something like object portraits, surrounding the Stieglitz circle, for example, all the way into like Rauschenberg and Johns and folks like that. And so he kind of falls between those two. And so I'm hoping that the book offers a way to kind of think about the ways in which still life and the kinds of politics that pervade Harnett's work might also have been informing that work that comes after him.
And Nika, that's a great tie-in to the Hartley piece, which is hanging here in the photograph that you're showing, because that Hartley is the still life, but it's also completely figurative, And so I want to give us a chance to do three things now. I want to remind people that they can see this exhibition at PAFA till April 2nd. And you too can have this exhibition come to your museum. There are 2 slots open. Contact the American Federation of the Arts. there will be a catalog for the exhibition. And Nika, where can people buy your book if they would like to?
Oh, thank you for asking. You can buy it from the University of California Press. It is on Amazon. If you do not want to participate in Amazon, it is available at other booksellers, but University of California Press definitely has it on their website.
So thank you, Nika. And I just want to thank you for this amazing food for thought, which, you make 19th century American art history super exciting, which of course I always think it is, but I can tell you that this audience is super engaged and they don't want to let you go.
Well, thank you all so much. Yeah, thank you for all of these fabulous questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nika. I also want to say we have another Art at Noon coming up on February 22nd with Anna Marley. She's going to be talking about Edward L. Loper in the Path of the Masters. So look to our website, and I'll be sending a link when I send the link for the recording in a couple days. Thank you. Thank you, Nika.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, friends, for coming.